Okay, so in the last couple of episodes we've got the body into paint and that's drying nicely on its drying stick, and it shouldn't be too much longer before we can actually start to do some work on that. And we've also got the pick guard all wired up and ready to go, which kind of only leaves us one major job on this build now, and that's to get the neck into finish. And this should be a relatively straightforward job. The most complex part of this is we've got a little decal to produce to go on the back, and we need to put one on the front as well, obviously with my logo. Other than that, it's fairly straightforward. This still needs a little bit of sanding. When I took the original finish off, it's left all of these edges quite sharp and square. So we'll be rounding all of those off, giving everything its final sand, getting rid of any kind of little inconsistencies. There's a little bit of roughness where I had to reshape this transition area following our reshaping of the headstock into the smaller style that we've used on this build. So that's all to be done. And also what I want to do before I go too much further is I just want to address the edges of this fretboard, because they're actually quite sharp, they're quite square, and I much prefer a guitar to have a little bit of a played in feeling and for those edges to be kind of a little bit rounded over and less sharp. And it's a relatively straightforward thing to do. People go about it in different ways. Some people scrape them with a razor blade or a utility knife blade and kind of blend them over like that. Some people might sand them a little bit. I just use the shaft of a screwdriver like this one and literally just use that as a tool to just rub those edges and just take that sharpness off. And it really does work. It just gives the edge of the fret that nice played in feeling. So I'm just going to work my way all the way up and down the fretboard doing that before we break out some sandpaper. And that's all done now. It took about 5 minutes in total to do that. So quite a quick job, but it really is worth the effort. Makes things feel so much nicer. And the only thing you need to remember is whatever tool you're using to do it, and this is just a kind of an old Torx driver, just make sure that the shaft of the tool is nice and smooth, so you're not kind of scratching or damaging the fretboard in any way. You're just literally compressing those corners and making them nice and smooth. So with that done, we can now break out some sandpaper and start to get this finish sanded. I'll just start on headstock with a 120 pad, and first thing I need to do is obviously remove this pencil line. Give it a nice sand off and then just start to kind of work those corners around a little bit. Before doing the same on the back. That's looking much better. Now most of the back of the neck doesn't really need a lot of sanding, just needs a kind of a final smooth off with something like 240 grit, just in preparation for the lacquer. However, this area does need a little bit more work, so I'm going to get that in the vise. And I think I'm going to start off with just a file, a bit of a half round file. And then we'll just again hit it with some 120 paper. And that is much better. So we're pretty much at the state now where we can get some 240 on this and just get it finished sanded. Okay, and that's the neck all properly sanded up. I've gone to 240 grit, it's all feeling nice and smooth, and we're ready to go. So all that leaves is for us to discuss what we're actually going to do with this neck. And I had a conversation with the owner, and I have been paying attention to the comments on the previous videos, and the consensus seems to be that most of those commenting would like to see this guitar not at all relicked. Unfortunately, that isn't a decision for me. It is going to get some relicking. That has always been the aim of this project. However, we've come to the decision that the neck is going to be option one, which was just a nice amber lacquer job with no wear through. It's a matte lacquer that's going to form the amber. There'll be the decals on the front and the back of the headstock. I will then over lacquer it in a clear, and that will be rubbed down but not polished. So it will have a kind of a matte or a semi-gloss appearance to it, like old lacquer that's had a bit of use and it's got a bit of oxidization on it. I think that's the look I'm going for and the best way of explaining it. So it's not going to be a heavy relic. We're not going to have great big areas on the back of the neck with no lacquer. It will just look like an old neck. And the first step in all of that is to get the fingerboard masked off. So I'll do that next, and then we can get it prepared and get it over to the spray booth and lay down that amber lacquer. Now there's a little bit of an issue on this neck in so much as the dot markers run right the way through the join between the rosewood or whatever it is and the maple, which means if I masked all of the rosewood off, I would have dots that were half amber and half white, which would obviously look rubbish. So I'm just going to mask slightly above them, and as long as I don't put a huge amount of the amber lacquer on, I don't think that you'll be able to see that. What I can do is I'll unmask it once I've got the amber on, and I'll just blend that join in, so hopefully it's less obvious. You never know, I might be able to just scrape that back a little bit and get it nice and neat, and then obviously when we over lacquer it with clear, that won't be a problem. There we are, masked off and ready to go. And this is going to be fairly straightforward. Got some vintage amber Nitor lacquer. Not really going to need much of this. I think 2 or 3 light coats should be absolutely fine. just a little bit thinner. A quick whiz up and we're ready to go. And I've just got the neck hung up on a screw in one of the neck screw holes, and I've just got a little bolt covered in masking tape stuffed into the bottom tuner hole, just so I've got a little bit of something to kind of grab onto and manipulate this. And fairly straightforward, like I say, 3, maybe 4 thin coats of the amber, apply the decals and then clear coat it. Okay, so there's the neck with its amber and 1 good clear coat on. Next up, I'm going to take off all this masking before I go any further. Because I want to deal with, or just check, that the edge that we put in with that masking actually looks okay, which it does. I think it actually looks really nice. So what I'm going to do is just give that a very quick rub down, and I'm going to use something like 1000 grit, something like that, something very fine, just to take that little step out, and then we can remask, but only to the edge of the fretboard. For when we put the rest of the clear coats on, now I don't really intend to put a huge amount on this neck, it doesn't really need it, it's not going to be polished to a high gloss, so I think it's more just to kind of tidy that edge up and seal it than anything else. And that actually went really quickly. I think the combination of there not being that much lacquer in that area and with it being on a radius just meant that it rubbed down really quickly. So with that done, I'm then just going to mask this back up, and I'm just going to very gently trim that. the edge of the fretboard. Now sometimes I don't lacquer the edge of fretboards, but in this case I think it is a good idea. Just to blend out the join between the lacquer on the neck and the fretboard. Okay, so with that all masked off, we can now get these decals sorted out. Now, I've made the decals, I don't know how well you can see them. These obviously were quite straightforward to do. I tried to reproduce the decal from the photograph that I took of the original one, and it just didn't really work. It looked a little bit rubbish, so I've redone it and tried to get as close as I can with the fonts, etc., and I think it looks kind of okay. So we'll get those cut out. As always, I try and kind of cut these out as close as I can to the actual lettering. And I always try and kind of round everything off a little bit, which I think helps get these blended in a little bit better. And these decals are just printed out on an inkjet printer with this Hayes Paper Company clear water slide decal paper. This is the best stuff I've ever used. It is really good. It's very thin when you get it off the backing paper, and it lays down really flat against your lacquer, so it doesn't take an awful lot of over lacquering. The only thing you need to remember with this is you do need to seal it with a few coats of acrylic before you do anything. That not only seals the ink in, but it also gives the decal a little bit more structure, so they don't kind of dissolve and turn to mushy jelly once you put them in the water. But very, very good stuff, highly recommended. And there's the little logo for the front. So I'll go and get some warm water, we can get these decals applied, and then it's just a case of a few coats of clear lacquer to get them covered over. And if you've ever made a model aeroplane in your youth, you'll know exactly how this works. Just let that soak in the water for a few seconds. And just slide it into position where we want it on the headstock. I always like to just kind of give it a little bit of a head start by dabbing off any excess moisture. And I think that looks quite nice. So just turn that over, do exactly the same on the back. And you do just need to be a bit careful with these, because they are delicate. So I'm going to leave these now probably about half an hour or so just for that to dry up, and then we can get this back over to the spray area and start to lay down some clear coat onto it. And with those dried up nicely, it's just a case now of getting a few coats of clear lacquer over the top. I'm going to start with quite a light dusting just to kind of seal that in, and then we'll gradually add thicker and thicker coats as we go through. So I'm going to take my time now and just keep coming back to this at regular intervals, add a little bit more lacquer until we get everything nice and smoothed out and bury those decals totally. That's obviously going to take quite a long time, so that's a good time for me to leave this episode. So I'll be back in a couple of days time when we will get back on with that body and start to get that paint polished out and looking a lot nicer. So until then, as always, don't forget to hit that like button if you've enjoyed this. Subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye bye.